So thank you. So today we have Clare Thornley with us. She will be talking about what's the title? Ethical data use in Irish public policy, the role of the Data Governance Board. So Clare is a board member of the Data Governance Board in Ireland. She has an MA in philosophy from the University of Edinburgh, an MSc in information management, and a PhD in information retrieval from the University of Strathclyde. And she has been a research associate here at UCL since 2011. She started her career as an information officer in the UK voluntary sector, and before completing her PhD, and she moved into research. As well as being in Data Governance Board member since 2021, Clare works as an independent consultant on EU and international digital skills and IT capability development projects, with a focus on developing ethical standards and guidelines. So I will stop here. Yes. I'll give you the stage. And yeah, you can go ahead. Let me just click. Okay.
So thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks very much for inviting me to come and do this seminar. As Katrina said, I'll be talking this afternoon focusing on the ethical data use in Irish public policy, with the focus clearly on my own role in the Data Governance Board, looking at broader issues of data information sharing and ethics and how that information and data is used. So let's start with the thing that we're going to cover this afternoon. So we'll start off with a bit of introduction about the current state of play in Ireland on digital and data maturity levels. How developed is that? What kind of context are we talking about when we're talking about data use and data sharing in public policy? I'll then briefly introduce the role of state boards. I'm not sure if they're what the UK equivalent would be exactly, so I'll describe them briefly, and the role of the Data Governance Board. There's just two aspects of the Data Governance Board work that I will talk about, which I have reflected as hopefully being relevant to this audience. One is looking at the whole issue of data sharing between different public bodies. Part of what we do is review that, and I'll be discussing a couple of examples and some of the issues that came up, also general issues. Then our second thing I'll be looking at is data. We developed a data ethics framework. I'll be talking about what's in that, but also perhaps more interest is how we went about developing it and some of the discussions that came up for that. Finally, just some general conclusions. Yeah, my last slide is, I think, is something that just implications of all of this really work for the field of information studies, and for some of the career options for our students. This is some of the personal reflection, which I hope will be useful. So we're starting off looking at Ireland's digital data maturity levels. In the recent annual report of the Data Governance Board, we get a very nice write-up in this. I've been kind of pleased with this. But the OECD, which does this sort of an annual digital government index with various different categories, and I must say we weren't in, to be perfect honestly, we weren't in the top 3 for all of them, but we were in this for data-driven public service. So Ireland is really a front runner in that particular aspect, and the other ones performing perfectly reasonably, but this is seen as one of the highest scoring ones. And there's somebody from the OECD that comes in to some of our meetings, and she's very positive about it. So there's definitely a lot of progress made and a big impetus to keep on getting better at it. So briefly, this is a very nice picture of the government buildings there. Even looking slightly Christmassy, I don't quite know why, but that is. So just as a role of what state boards are, I've just underlined the thing that's really important. I mean, they're not to do with executing government policy or getting things done, generally speaking. It's more strategic input and critical oversight from diverse perspectives. So the idea is at a fairly high level view of what's going on, and to try and get a range of different people in the room, from different perspectives. Somebody from industry, somebody from the court service, is quite a big range of different views. And then bringing us on to the actual data governance board. So yeah, its role is to try and keep Ireland in that top 3, I suppose, is what you could argue. As an impressively, perhaps slightly too long list of competences, I should say that the ones at the bottom, climate change and AI, will be more coming to the fore in the next 2 or 3 years. So the focus, I've been working on this board for about 3 years now, and the main issues that we've been looking at is data protection and ethics, and yeah, the legal and the research and analytics. So the other things that are coming, but not quite yet, and also communications. I'll just touch on that later, but that's been an ongoing thing to try and get better at. There's a bit more legal context and history. So it was basically as a result of this Data Sharing and Governance Act that it has to exist, and it's to try and manage that process of sharing data within the public service to get things done better and to find out what is working and what isn't. So it's about efficiency and also about monitoring progress. And people obviously then have some concerns about where's this data going, how's it being shared, and for what purpose, and it's to try and provide some reassurance and oversight over that whole process. And that's what we're supposed to advise, promote, and review. So again, we're not actually involved in the actual getting things done part of public policy. So now I'll just highlight here, I think what is in the principles along the bottom of that slide. So I'll maybe discuss briefly about how we're doing on those principles. So the open engagement is a key part of the role of the board and the sort of the vision of how data management and data sharing will happen in Ireland, that citizens are involved in that and they know what's going on, they have an understanding of what's going on. So the aim is to be transparent. So you know, the material we've discussed is obviously with some limits to do with privacy and security issues is available to be viewed. Now clearly, just because it's available doesn't mean that people are necessarily looking at it, because as we were saying, not everyone is that interested in these issues, but that could definitely always be improved on. But that's something that the aim is. And again, the overall purpose is not, clearly not to share data just because it's a nice thing to do, but to have a clear purpose and to make sure that's done, and the services are better and they're more efficient, and the public gets both a better deal in terms of how the taxpayers' money is spent and a better service. Safe and secure, obviously. Ethical, people will be considering ethical issues as they're sharing it, and efficient. So that's just an overview of the principles by which this work is designed to be done. And that's a bit more on the transparency, which I was asked to include by them, just to make sure. It's very important that you let everyone know how transparent it all is. So yeah, the legislation actually insists that the data sharing agreements, for example, are published online when they're finished. So it's a statutory obligation to be transparent too. And just as the final point there, so when developing a proposed data sharing agreement, which is about sharing data between different public bodies, as part of that, the relevant civil service departments are supposed to contact people that they think are relevant stakeholders. But you can imagine that's not entirely straightforward.
Practical.
Yeah. So who gets to decide who that is? And part of the ethical framework that we worked on was to try and formalize that process a bit. So it's a bit more than, Claire, who do you think is a relevant stakeholder? I can't think of anyone. Oh, okay. Or maybe one or two things that came to mind. So that's been an ongoing issue. So I'm now looking at a bit more detail at the actual data sharing agreements and review process. So just to clarify what that means, to slow down a bit. So data sharing there's a legal meaning in this sense, means the disclosure of information, including personal data, by a public body to another public body. So we're still definitely only talking here within government circles. There's no question you're being shared with private companies or anything, as not at this stage anyway. Because of the Act, if these two bodies want to carry on sharing data or start sharing data, they have to go through the Data Governance Board so that it's reviewed and there's some oversight of the process. So clearly, I'm not going to cover every single one we went through, but if you are so interested, you can look at the list so far there from the link. But I've just picked out a couple of examples that I think reveal some interesting issues of more broad interest. So one is the question of turbary rights, which you may not know what that is. That's okay. Not just hardly anybody in the Data Governance Board, apart from one person whose father was a farmer. So turbary rights are the right to cut turf on particular bogs that was handed down from family to family. So within English law, it probably would be similar to grazing rights or rights to common land. So they're quite long-standing legal rights, which are dearly held and seen as, you know, a very important heritage that you can pass on to your family. Now, as the audience may not be so aware, that from the EU, there's a lot of habitats that this particular directive, and also a much wider understanding of the role that bogs play in sequestering carbon and stopping, reducing the speed of climate change, shall we say. So basically, you're not allowed to drain and cut them anymore, which has caused quite a lot of controversy and difficulties within Ireland because of the long-standing nature of these debates. Anyway, sorry, in terms of the data sharing, what that means is the government has to know who's got rights to do this turf cutting, and link that with the relevant environmental departments. Because if it was me, for example, I'm not allowed to cut turf anymore, I can get compensation for that. So it's kind of, the bad news is you can't cut turf anymore, and the good news is that you can you have some money. But this, for me, it reveals some quite interesting things, partly because the data on this, there's quite low quality data in many cases about how these rights and how well documented it was. Some of it was quite old, and people also, it could be contested or disputed, and there might have been some informal arrangement that had worked for years, but when you went back to the records, it wasn't reflected. But I think that was quite an interesting example of when you formalize data, or you need it to be formalized in a way to get something, it can throw up some interesting ethical and social issues as well. Another one, staying with the sort of agricultural kind of countryside theme, again, that was farm animal data. If you wanted to get the Board BIA, which is the Food Authority Board quality stamp, you had to share data on your herds, and they had to be checked every now and then. And people weren't too happy. There's that slight tension between, well, I really want to get this quality seal, but I don't really like the idea of people knowing everything that I have and be able to come randomly and check on me. So that was quite an interesting one too. And finally, on something which I'm sure to an extent at least has happened in the UK too, getting involved in these international education research progress studies. I think the best one known probably is the acronym PISA, the Programme for International Student Assessment, but other ones on different parts of school learning. So that was that's an ongoing piece of work, really, which is trying to get data from schools and to get it in such a way that it's anonymized enough that it can be reliably researched upon. And also that's another example of when the need to do this kind of revealed holes in the data collection, data quality processes within schools, a big variety. I should say, I think I know that in Ireland, the schools are much more independent entities than they would be in England. So there's not such a, I don't know what the quality of school data is like here, but it's pretty challenging in Ireland that each school has its own data set of the children in it, and they're not connected. So yeah, that's an ongoing issue. So yeah, so these are just 3 examples. The other ones there, but yeah, all I think brought up some quite interesting aspects, both practical from a policy point of view, but also for me personally, almost from a theoretical point of view about what happens when you formalise data or when you try to find it out, collect it, and realise there's holes in what's going on. So yeah, some of the issues that came up, which I think were interesting to briefly touch upon. They were all put out for public consultation, but to be fair, that was done through the website, which no one's pretending that people spend their time trawling through the Data Governance Board website. So at the same time, as I said, the relevant public servants increasingly were told have the obligation to actually identify and proactively contact the groups that would be affected to try and preempt any issues and get, so that became better as they went on. And sometimes the input was extremely useful, and you could see, oh yeah, that's something that we should change and how we're going to do this. Some of them, to my mind anyway, revealed a sort of ongoing issue among the public about not really understanding GDPR, not knowing what personal data was, feeling that they shouldn't have to share stuff which they actually have a legal obligation to share, or concerns about privacy, which, strictly speaking, we look at it and say, well, that's not really a privacy issue, but people obviously perceive it to be one as such, so it is for them. And it just brought home to me how, in all these issues around data privacy and data ethics and data use and policy, there's just a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of concerns, but some of which are completely valid and some of which, if they'd been better communicated and better explained, might not have come up. I'd also say in general, this is true of the consultation process and also of the public sector itself in terms of how I looked at these issues, was that there was people are much more frightened of a data breach, they're much more frightened of data protection issues, they're much more frightened about loss of privacy than they are about the risk of, if we don't share this data, what could go wrong. And to me, that again was another big education issue, both across the public and also across the public sector. So yeah, pretty risk averse, which is not surprising for public sector organisations, of course, but trying to slightly shift the mindset to say, well, hang on, what are the risks of, if we don't share this, what could go wrong? And as I touched upon with the school system, sometimes, the data quality, you say you want to share the data, but perhaps then you realise that the quality isn't consistent, or it's got holes in it, bigger or smaller depending, and security isn't adequate. So again, it can be all very well having these high level discussions within the senior civil servants, but if the actual schools or the actual farms or the actual issues, the data's not there, it's just causing a problem. And there definitely could be weaknesses in the chain, and of course any weakness affects the quality of what you've got at the end. So I know the second thing I was really going to talk about today was the specifically ethical aspects of the board's work. So that's the work of the Data Safeguarding and Transparency Committee. Compulsory long title. So just to go over the purpose and role of that, so it's to provide a cross-cutting approach to all the other committees to ensure that transparency, privacy, or data protection concerns that arise are managed in an ethical way. But it's really under the advise and promote aspect of the Data Governance Board's remit. The co-chairs, myself and my colleague Joanne Deary. Just one perhaps useful thing to mention is when we were discussing the name of this committee, we actually took the word ethics out of it, which now we wonder about sometimes. But I think it's an ongoing challenge of they wanted to have a committee focusing on ethical issues, but at the same time want to make it clear that every committee, every area of the work has to consider these issues. So that's why it's a focus on the cross-cutting approach. Yeah, so it's that having a specialist focus on ethics in one area of the work, but really working to make sure that that's incorporated across. Obviously, everything that's happening mustn't be happening in isolation. So again, that shows you the other committees there, for example. So the data sharing and the architecture one and the communication one, all of those clearly need to be thinking about ethical issues, but that's not their primary focus. So that was the difference, and that's a little picture just showing us where we are in the scheme of the public sector. Yeah, Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, and the OGCO is the Office of the Chief Government Information Officer. So yeah, this I'll just will finally be the last thing I'll be talking about is how we develop this data sharing ethics framework, which is nearly ready. It'll be coming out early next year. So yeah, the idea behind that was to try and provide more guidance to public servants working in this area. As obviously they have to meet the legal obligation, but it was to try and more than a checklist, but to establish ways of thinking and to integrate ethical considerations into the process the way they were already working. So yeah, step-by-step evaluation. We did this again with the wider committee and with some experts who actually created the framework. So the main objective was to establish the public good, which I'll be talking about a little bit later. And the three principles that we agreed on after quite a lot of discussion to focus on were consider the benefits, as in what's positive about sharing this data, what's positive about this data initiative, consider what can go wrong. We did initially have consider the risks, but then on reflection, I think this was quite an interesting discussion, which is why I shared in this presentation. It was felt that the term risk is used in quite a specific way, and obviously we want to avoid risks. But if you're slightly more open to say, well, hang on, what could go wrong if we do this? What kind of things, what unexpected things might, to encourage a more sort of open-ended consideration of that, rather than simply here's a list of risks and how can we avoid them. And again, apply open engagement as a way of doing things. And so there will be a framework document, so that's nearly ready, or might even be ready now, but I don't think it's been published. And user-friendly toolkits with a use case example, as I touched upon, a stakeholder mapping template to help with the stakeholder identification and contact, because that definitely needed some work doing. And also a table sort of listing action questions which people could ask themselves when they're going through each stage of their work process. So it's more of a if you're at this stage, stop for a few minutes and consider these questions, talk about it with your colleagues, just to try and slow the whole thing down a bit so people are adopting these considerations at all times. And there's a picture of it. If you want this bit too small to see. But yeah, you can see the questions there, sort of what could go wrong, give suggestions to people to what they might want to look at. Some of the things that again came up when we were developing this work across the board as a whole. Some people have the view that basically we shouldn't create such an ethics framework because we already have a legal framework to work on, and there's really no value and perhaps some risk in adding an ethical layer to that. I thought that was an interesting perspective, and again, it just brings out the distinction between legal compliance and ethical compliance not being the same thing. As I said earlier on, trying to articulate and get people to recognise the value of sharing data for ethical reasons as well, and efficiency reasons can be challenging. That focus on ethical risk is nearly always instinctively almost about data privacy issues. And also, we've said that the overriding principle is establishing the public good. But I apologise for Jenny Benton, I know who's stuff somewhere in the building, so he won't come in. It's clearly not entirely straightforward to establish what that is. And as we said, with the stakeholder engagement, there will be some groups that are not going to be happy with what you've decided to do with the data. It doesn't, for whatever reason, maybe justified, maybe objectively speaking not justified, but still strongly felt. They're not happy about it. It doesn't work for them. It puts them in a more difficult situation for whatever reason. And a final point, which I slightly apologise for saying to this audience, but again, this confusion came up. Digital and data are clearly not the same, but there's a lot of confusion about that. And if you digitize something and data must be in it, must be good.
Yeah.
Or the other way around. So these are just some of the issues that came up during our discussions. And I'm getting to the end now, yes, which is about right, I think.
Yeah.
So yes, what I've tried to touch on this afternoon is to give you just an overview of our role and the work of Data Governance Board and the work of the Data Transfer, Data Sharing and Balancing Committee in more detail. I will discuss what I could do as topic for the seminar, and I think it was agreed this would be a useful example, from another country, from another perspective about the role of data in public policy and some of the ethical issues that arise. Me also personally, I think is a concrete example of some of the dilemmas and tensions that exist in this area when we're dealing with information and data that it's very difficult to find an absolutely right way of doing it. There's going to be some compromise or some trade-offs or conflicts that we just cannot get rid of. I also think it's an interesting example of something my own personal interest, and I think it's a very important issue also, is how do you integrate the ethical issues into people's ways of working, into the tools that they use. So when they're working with data, they, as part of good practice and how they do that in general, they're also considering the ethical and social aspects of what they're doing as they're going through it, rather than just having a code of ethics, stuck on the wall or something. So again, this is something I think to pass on to your students, or maybe some of them are on this call, I don't know. But this, I only came across this whole world of frameworks, bodies of knowledge and toolkits really about 10 or 11 years ago. And it struck me immediately that they are so related to library and information studies in terms of their creation and how they're used and the logic of them, that I think it's an interesting area to consider for research, but also in terms of careers for students they could go into. Ethical issues are becoming increasingly important, and a lot of them are based around IT and data, and clearly there's an increased public awareness about the data, those issues, ethics of those issues as well. And yeah, as we all know, the use of data and information in policy making is becoming increasingly formalised. So to my mind, that's it's good news for our students, and also presents interesting research and policy opportunities. So that's the conclusion. I think this is just some references. One is the OECD report. One is if you really want to go and look at all the shown agreements you can do. And one is just a paper that I did with some colleagues about this issue of how you integrate ethics into frameworks and bodies of knowledge. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Okay. I'll stop.